Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're going to be talking about the potential goal, or one of the potential goals, in the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. As many of you probably know, perhaps literally every single one of you, or if not, now you know, Breath of the Wild 2 has been delayed into spring 2023. And yet, despite this delay, as opposed to not talking about Breath of the Wild 2, we're going to be talking about more of Breath of the Wild 2. This will be the third video this week, and you know what? I may even make it a bit of a series where I talk about Breath of the Wild 2 maybe at least once per week leading up to the release, which could be about a year from now, maybe a little bit less, so we may be looking at about 50 or so Breath of the Wild 2 videos before the release of the game, although if I'm a betting man, I'm going to argue perhaps even more, because as we approach the release, there will be more news prompting potentially more videos. But anyways, this time around, we're going to be focusing on a potential goal for Breath of the Wild 2 that could be suggested by the very few snippets of new footage we got from the announcement of its delay. So then, what is the goal in Breath of the Wild 2? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now before we jump into things, let me first very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out. It is linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe or perhaps consider joining as a member. So in the new footage, we see Link in what appears to be the Sky Realm of some sort, and there's a big glowing light, and he pulls out his sword, the Master Sword, and it's glowing a blue, but at the same time, his grayed up damaged hand that has these little armaments around it is also glowing as well, and there's a bit of some sort of rune or text on its hand. It's kind of reminiscent of the Monado from Xenoblade. Not saying it's literally a Xenoblade reference, but it could be related to some sort of rune-like ability or something similar to the Sheikah Slate and its abilities. That's a possibility there. But the big thing to note here is that he pulls out the Master Sword in front of this light. There's a big gold glowing light. His hand is glowing gold as well, and the Master Sword is glowing a blue, but what you may notice very clearly, the Master Sword isn't what it used to be. It's clearly very damaged. How did this happen? What does this mean? Well, if we go back to the first trailer for Breath of the Wild 2, we do see something happen between Link and Zelda, and what we're assuming is Ganondorf, given the Gerudo jewelry and the clothes and the robes and such, and the clear allusions to Ganondorf in the past from the cave paintings. So probably Ganondorf, and he's coming back to life here as the source of Calamity Ganon, and there appears to be some damage done. Something happens to Link's hand. Ganondorf comes back to life. Perhaps Ganondorf saw them coming. Perhaps Ganondorf did things in his sort of corpse-like mummified state to bring them to the source of all of this, and it was a trap, and that's why a lot of bad things happen. Zelda falls down a hole, something happens to Link's hand. Perhaps in this moment where something happens to Link's hand, this is when the Master Sword is damaged as well as his hand, and that's what leads to what we're seeing here in this new piece of footage. And the very clear, obvious thing that's probably going on here, Ganondorf has come back to life. We see him in more full force in the second trailer, and even the castle is rising up to the sky again. So it does seem to be that Ganondorf takes over, comes back to life, at least gets rid of Zelda for a little while by getting her to fall down some sort of hole or void, and Link's hand and sword are damaged. So then who can stop Ganondorf? Well, Link, because he's not dead yet, and I think that throughout the course of Breath of the Wild 2, there will be a restoration for the Master Sword, because the Master Sword is the evil's bane. It can seal away the darkness. It is what has contained Ganondorf over the generations, or Ganon, and Link is probably going to need the Master Sword to be restored in order to do that. I don't think this is really an alien concept for a Zelda game. Zelda games typically carry over different motifs and themes throughout the different Zelda games, and this time around I think they will have a few more, and one of them is going to have to do with the Master Sword and bringing it back to full force or life. In Skyward Sword, a big point of the game was to establish the Master Sword and strengthen it so it could take down Demise. In The Wind Waker, the Master Sword wasn't what it was supposed to be when you first draw it. You have to power it up at a few different temples, and we've seen this sort of idea in different Zelda games, So to see it again in Breath of the Wild 2, I don't think that's too crazy. I think that should maybe even be expected, and with this new footage, that seems to be pretty obvious. The Master Sword is damaged, Ganondorf is in full power, perhaps stronger than ever before. They're going to need to power up this sword and at least restore it here. So that's what I think is going to be the main goal for Breath of the Wild 2 as we explore around the world. And in this scene right here, perhaps this is already the beginning of that. Perhaps there's something going on there. And this perhaps could be another hint of the return of temples and dungeons, of classical style temples and dungeons that a lot of Zelda fans have wanted in Breath of the Wild. Now when I say classical style temples and dungeons, I still think they'll be sort of reimagined in the Breath of the Wild style, sure, but still something more significant than the shrines and such we saw throughout Breath of the Wild. Now hopefully it's obvious, but this is a theory. We don't know if this is actually how things are going to sort of play out, so I will consider another option here. We do have some concept art from Breath of the Wild, where we see Link with a broken Master Sword similar to this one, except this time around in the concept art, you see his face is covered, you see he has some sort of weird sort of technology on his right hand. It's not quite the same look as what we're seeing with Link this time around, but there are some similar concepts here. It's clear in both images, Link is damaged. It's clear in both images, the Master Sword is damaged. And it's also clear that this power Link has in both images can do different things. We've seen in the second trailer for Breath of the Wild 2 that Link can do different things like stopping giant metal balls and reversing its specific own time. And we're seeing here with its glowingness sort of doing something with the Master Sword, perhaps responding to that golden light. So there are different powers at hand here, but it may not be the case that what we're seeing is the Master Sword being restored. While I think that could be the case, and I think likely will have something to do with the main objective for Breath of the Wild 2, there could be other things. So, for example, perhaps this is simply the Master Sword responding to something important. We did see the Master Sword do this actually back in the initial Breath of the Wild, which was some sort of reference to Fi from Skyward Sword, or Fi, depending on how you choose to pronounce it. This could have something to do with that. Another thing to consider here, perhaps the Master Sword will stay damaged. Perhaps Link will grow stronger in a different way. And as we see from this other concept art here, there was already this idea of different powers extending from Link's hand. What if the Master Sword is just sort of like a device to channel those powers? What if the Master Sword can become a bigger, more powerful beam sword? What if the Master Sword can become a weird claw shot like device, or something of that ilk or design? I think that's a possibility, and this golden hand could be what causes all of that, and the Master Sword is simply the device that it sort of pulls from. That's a possibility as well. Now, it's also possible that everything I'm saying here is true, and then at the end, we're still having a Master Sword that is restored, but this weird glowy-like power simply expands upon those powers, and the Master Sword can do even more in its more complete form. We know that a lot of the DLC ideas and things that didn't pan out in Breath of the Wild led to the creation of Breath of the Wild 2. So when we take a look at some of this concept art here, and we're seeing some sort of interesting ideas with the damaged sword and the different power-ups and such, I think there's a pretty good chance that a lot of these ideas will carry over here. Will these ideas result to what I've suggested, or could it be something entirely different? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below about what could be the main objective, or one of the main objectives in Breath of the Wild 2, and does it at all have to relate to the Master Sword like I've been discussing? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.